Last week, I was sitting in this minimalist cafe just blocks from the Berlaymont building in Brussels.
Right in the heart of it all.
Exactly. And I was sharing an espresso with a senior policy advisor. And this guy, he was just beaming. I mean, truly radiant. He's tapping his fingers on this leather-bound copy of a new regulatory framework.
He was proud of it.
Proud is an understatement. To him, it wasn't just a document, it was a masterpiece.
Yeah.
He started talking about European integration and strategic autonomy with this, almost religious fervor.
Like it's an article of faith.
It was. He was convinced that just a few more directives from the Commission would finally cement the continent's place as a global superpower. And his eyes just lit up when he mentioned the Green Deal. He called it the ultimate triumph of reason over national ego.
Wow.
So he's deep into this monologue about the irreversibility of the whole European project, and then his phone buzzes with a news alert. It was a live feed from a parliamentary session in a member state, I think it was the Czech Republic, and you could see lawmakers literally cheering after a vote to just flatly ignore a Brussels mandate on energy quotas.
Oh, that had to sting.
The advisor's face, it didn't just fall, it turned this strange, ashen gray. All that giddy excitement just evaporated instantly.
And what did he do? Did he try to argue the policy points?
No, not at all. He didn't pull up economic data. He didn't offer a counter-argument. He just started scrolling frantically through his phone, muttering about populist sabotage. He said they were ungrateful nations that don't understand the process.
The process, that's the key phrase right there.
It was so jarring.
Yeah.
One moment, he's the architect of a new world, and the next, he's just a man watching a dam burst from his lawn chair. And then he dropped this incredibly revealing line. He said, "If we let them choose for themselves now, everything we've built since the war disappears."
Wow. That says everything. It's not about winning the argument anymore. It's about preventing the choice.
Exactly. That pivot from supreme arrogance to this frantic, almost panicked condemnation of democracy itself was stunning. It wasn't a rational defensive policy. It was an emotional breakdown. And it made me realize the engine of Europe hasn't just slowed down, it has completely stalled.
When the elite's only response is to curse the voters for wanting their sovereignty back, you're looking at something much deeper than a policy dispute.
That's our mission today. We need to unpack that observation, this European terminal report card. The crucial question isn't just what happens to Europe as this Franco-German engine grinds to a final silent halt in 2025. It's whether the same bureaucratic decay, that same structural paralysis we see crippling Brussels, is already deep inside the walls of Washington, D.C.
That is exactly the right framing. We're using Europe as a kind of a cautionary tale, a case study for the administrative state itself. And to really diagnose what the sources call this dying empire, we have to look at the crisis across three distinct dimensions.
Okay, what are they?
First, the political collapse of elite consensus, where that traditional firewall against popular movements is just breaking down. Then we have to pivot to the economic paralysis caused by central planning and this regulatory overreach that's literally driving innovation offshore.
And the third?
And finally, we'll do a deep comparative study of the structural federal deficits that make the EU system so unstable. And that's where we see the most profound warning for the U.S. administrative state.
So let's start with the political reckoning. We have to start with the people on the ground, the voters, because that's where legitimacy either takes root or, completely dissolves.
Exactly. This isn't abstract. It's rooted in a deep resentment toward an institutional elite that many feel prioritize these grand global ideological projects over their own prosperity and security.
Right. And I was struck by a report that really brings this to life. It featured a woman named Camille, a third-generation vineyard owner in rural France. For years, she was just a standard moderate voter. She believed the European project offered stability, protection, all of that. But then the climate directives from Brussels, this green dogma, started hitting her bottom line.
And the reality changed.
The reality changed completely. By early 2025, she was facing skyrocketing costs for fertilizers, for pesticides. And at the same time, she's having to compete with cheaper imports from outside the EU imports that don't have to follow any of those same crushing environmental standards.
So she's being asked to make a sacrifice for an ideal while her competitors are not. That creates a profound dissonance.
A profound realization is what she called it. In the last local election, she didn't just vote for a sovereigntist candidate, she was out there campaigning. And she told a reporter that the political firewall, that mechanism designed to keep the so-called extremists out, she realized it wasn't built to keep out genuinely harmful ideas.
It was built to keep out her voice.
Exactly. It was built to keep out her voice and the voices of her neighbors.
That anecdote just perfectly captures this erosion of trust. It's what's behind the vanishing center all across Europe. The elite's whole post-war vision of ever closer integration is collapsing because ordinary people feel that the grand coalitions betrayed their national interests. And the evidence for this is it's undeniable. It's this unthinkable surge of hard-right and sovereigntist parties.
We really need to put that surge in context, especially in a place like Germany, where that political center was supposed to be completely unshakable.
The numbers are, frankly, alarming for the establishment. In Germany, the Alternative for Germany, the AfD, they secured over 20% of the vote in the late February 2025 regional elections.
20%.
And just for context, that is the strongest showing for any hard-right group in Germany since 1933. I mean, that's a seismic event.
What's their platform? What's driving that appeal?
It's really three core pillars. One, ending mass migration. Two, a radical renegotiation or even a potential exit from the Eurozone. And three, a complete reversal of the Green Deal, which they argue is just crushing German industry. The fact that this message has gained so much traction in Europe's economic heartland, it tells you the old consensus is dead.
And it's not just Germany.
No, not at all. This trend is everywhere. Look at Austria. The Anti-Establishment Freedom Party, the FPO, they achieved a historic 29% victory in their 2024 elections. Again, the strongest far-right showing since the Second World War.
Okay, so if the center is shrinking and these parties are surging, what are the traditional parties doing to hold on? The sources talk about the cordon sanitaire, the firewall failing.
Right.
What exactly is that, and why is it breaking down now?
The cordon sanitaire is, it's essentially a tactical agreement, a political firewall between the mainstream parties, center-right, center-left, Greens, liberals, where they all agree to refuse to cooperate with the hard right.
So they freeze them out. No coalitions, no power sharing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The purpose is to isolate them, delegitimize them, and keep them out of government. But the mechanism is strained, or in some places just broken, because the far right is simply too large to be ignored anymore.
And you see this playing out where?
Acutely in Belgium. The conservative Flemish N-VA narrowly won in June 2024, but the hard-right Vlaams Belang came in second. The result? A political deadlock for over 6 months because no mainstream party can form a government without them, but they refuse to cross that line.
So paralysis.
Total paralysis. And in France, you have the National Rally leading elections, forcing the traditional parties into these desperate emergency coalitions just to block them. You see, when a fringe party becomes the largest single voting bloc, the firewall starts to look less like a principled stand and more like an anti-democratic tactic.
So how is the institutional center-right, like the big European People's Party, the EPP, reacting? The sources use this strong language, a quiet but wholesale betrayal of the Brussels agenda. What does that mean in practice?
It is strong language. Maybe a better way to put it is a pragmatic pivot that's been forced on them by electoral reality. The EPP is facing this massive exodus of voters to sovereigntist parties, so they're executing a strategic realignment. They are quietly but fundamentally undermining the very green dogma that they championed just a few years ago.
So they're walking back on their own policies.
They are. They used to support these stringent deadlines for phasing out combustion engines, aggressive climate targets. Now they're openly questioning the 2035 engine ban. They're seeking exemptions for farmers from the farm-to-fork strategy. They're emphasizing national energy security, which means, supporting domestic gas and even coal.
They're stealing the hard right's talking points to survive.
In a way, yes. They're prioritizing pragmatic national interests and electoral survival over ideological purity. They're effectively executing parts of the sovereigntist agenda from within the establishment to stop the bleeding.
Which means the entire political center of gravity in Europe is shifting. It's not the Franco-German engine anymore.
It's not. The center of gravity has decisively moved east to Central Europe. Countries like the Czech Republic, Poland, Hungary, they were once dismissed as, peripheral troublemakers. Now they're the new agenda setters.
How are they setting the agenda?
Their governments, often led by these pragmatic sovereigntists, are actively dismantling EU overreach, not by leaving, but by staying inside and strategically blocking, litigating, or just not implementing key EU directives. They're proving that Brussels mandates are not irreversible.
Okay, let's pivot a bit to the geopolitical dimension here. There's this transatlantic ideological marriage being formed, what's called the MAGA megalink. Why is the U.S. right suddenly so invested in European nationalists?
Because it's an extension of U.S. domestic politics. It's part of the culture war against what they see as a globalist elite. Donald Trump and his network, institutions like the Heritage Foundation and Project 2025, they're actively partnering with these parties across Europe. Viktor Orban calls it Make Europe Great Again, or MEGA.
So for them, the EU isn't just a trading bloc.
Not at all. For the U.S. right, the EU represents the fully realized version of the enemy they fight at home, ruled by unaccountable bureaucrats, global climate mandates overriding national economies, and a hostility toward traditional culture. They see European nationalists as civilizational allies in a global fight.
And we've seen some very specific, very high-profile interventions from American figures.
We have. Vice President J.D. Vance gave a major speech at the Munich Security Conference in February 2025, where he openly endorsed the AfD in Germany. That's a potential U.S. administration actively intervening in a European election on the side of the nationalists.
And it's not just politicians.
Right. You have figures like Elon Musk publicly endorsing the AfD and amplifying their message on social media. It shows a clear, high-level strategy of integration and support from influential Americans. They're aiming to destabilize the liberal consensus in Brussels.
And it goes beyond just moral support. You mentioned a blueprint.
Exactly. The Heritage Foundation hosted a closed-door workshop with key Hungarian and Polish nationalists, and they reportedly refined a strategic blueprint called the Great Reset, restoring member state sovereignty in the 21st century.
So this is a literal playbook.
It's a detailed plan for hollowing out the EU institutions, systematically targeting the Commission's power, limiting the European Court's jurisdiction, and restoring veto power to national parliaments. It's a coordinated infrastructure to export conservative strategy from DC to Europe and back again.
So if this common political will has collapsed and this external pressure is building, how does all this political fragmentation lead to institutional paralysis in Brussels?
Well, the EU is structurally dependent on consensus. When that evaporates, the whole machine just grinds to a halt. The EU can't act decisively on the big projects anymore, a common defense force, a single market for services, managing borders, because every major decision shatters against the rocks of these resurgent national interests.
So everyone is looking out for themselves first.
Everyone is prioritizing domestic stability and national sovereignty. The mandate for deeper integration is gone. The system is still there, it's still complex, but it is effectively paralyzed by its own lack of legitimacy.
And what's the ultimate spark for all this? It feels like a reaction to something fundamental.
The sources are very clear on this. It is a direct result of the state's failure in its two primary duties, security and basic economics. It's the social contract breaking down.
How so?
When citizens in, say, certain Swedish neighborhoods are facing endemic gang violence and the state can't provide physical security, they logically withdraw their consent from the leaders responsible. A vote for a sovereigntist party becomes an act of self-preservation.
And the economics.
The economic cost of the green dogma is transforming ordinary workers into anti-establishment voters. When high energy costs and deindustrialization crush the middle class, they vote against the elites who are telling them to sacrifice their prosperity for these ideological climate goals. It's a survivalist vote, and it's happening all across the continent.
That political crisis is so deeply tied to this economic paralysis. Let me frame this with an anecdote I was reading about. It's about a young software architect in Berlin named Lucas.
Okay.
He spent 3 years developing this brilliant piece of techonomic car, a decentralized energy sharing algorithm. Could have revolutionized how neighborhoods manage solar grids. His peers in Silicon Valley were already scaling a similar platform.
Right, with very little regulatory friction.
Exactly. But Lucas, he spent his critical innovation phase buried under compliance paperwork from the EU's AI Act and data sovereignty directives. He wasn't fighting competitors, he was fighting a 400-page regulatory checklist.
Designed by people who have probably never written a line of code.
That's the feeling. And his project eventually just collapsed. Investors saw the regulatory risk as too high. And this story perfectly illustrates the diagnosis of the recent Draghi report. Prioritizing the process of regulation over the product of genius is actively driving innovation offshore.
The Draghi report is. It's a necessary document, but a painful one for Brussels. It's a definitive analysis of how this Brussels-led central planning, for all its good intentions about consumer safety, is creating a structurally hostile environment for innovation compared to the American model.
So let's get into the numbers on this, the regulatory avalanche. Just how much more is the EU regulating than the United States?
The comparison is really stark. Between 2019 and 2024, the EU introduced about 13,000 new regulations.
13,000.
Now compare that to the U.S. In the same 5-year period, the U.S. enacted about 5,500 new federal regulations. So the EU is putting out more than double the volume of red tape. And this acts as a severe brake on businesses, especially the smaller ones that don't have huge legal departments.
And it's not just the quantity, right? Lucas wasn't just dealing with one layer of rules.
That's the thicket problem. The EU now has around 100 tech-focused laws and over 270 different regulators active across the member states. It's this patchwork of overlapping, sometimes contradictory rules. And then you have gold plating, where national governments add even stricter rules on top of the EU directives.
So doing business across borders in the EU is a nightmare for a small company.
It's just not cost effective. They can't afford to navigate 27 different legal interpretations.
And the consequence of this is what the material calls the unicorn exodus.
It's a structural brain drain. The complexity means only big companies, often non-EU ones, can handle it. So the result is quantifiable. Out of 147 EU unicorn startups valued over $1 billion, 40 of them have already relocated their headquarters abroad.
And where are they going?
The vast majority are moving to the U.S. They're going for easier access to a big single market, less regulatory friction, and deeper pools of venture capital.
Yeah.
It's crippling Europe's ability to compete in deep tech like AI and biotech.
The report also goes after the EU's core philosophy, this precautionary approach. What does that mean in practice for, say, an AI company?
The precautionary approach means the EU tries to mitigate every potential risk before a product is even launched. They regulate ex ante. The US, on the other hand, generally regulates ex post after a product is on the market and a real harm materializes.
Can you give a concrete example?
Sure, the AI Act. It imposes all these extra regulatory requirements and assessments on AI models that exceed a certain level of computational power. This is a huge problem because the competitive edge in AI comes from scale, from massive data sets and computing power. These upfront requirements are an active deterrent to reaching that necessary scale.
So European companies are put at a disadvantage from the start.
A distinct disadvantage compared to the US, where the private sector has more freedom, and China, where the state can just command massive data aggregation. The EU prioritizes safety and process, but it sacrifices global leadership in the process.
So beyond things like the AI Act, Brussels is now trying to export this philosophy globally. This brings us to the fifth horseman of the regulatory state, regulation from abroad, and the prime example is the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, or CSDDD.
The CSDDD is really the sharpest point of conflict between Brussels and Washington right now. It is a clear attempt at an extraterritorial power grab.
Break that down. What does it do?
At its core, it forces large companies operating in the European market to monitor and prevent adverse human rights and environmental impacts, not just in their own operations, but throughout their entire global supply chain.
Why does Washington see that as a power grab?
Because the mandates go way beyond current U.S. law. The CSDDD is trying to force American businesses to meet aggressive European environmental goals, like 55% carbon reduction by 2030. And crucially, it tries to impose labor norms from UN or European conventions that have never been ratified by the U.S. Senate.
So Brussels is trying to set the rules for American companies.
They're trying to redefine American corporate behavior through the threat of European legal penalties.
What's the practical impact on American companies, especially the smaller ones who aren't the primary target?
The indirect impact is the most dangerous. The directive targets large firms, but the due diligence requirement applies to their suppliers. So to avoid getting sued in European courts, these big companies have to audit their entire global supply chains.
And it's just easier to cut ties.
It's easier and cheaper to just exclude smaller, non-European suppliers, including American small businesses, than to risk the liability. It effectively shuts American SMEs out of global contracts.
And this strikes at something really fundamental about U.S. corporate governance.
Precisely. American corporate law is state-centered. A board's primary duty is to its shareholders. The CSDDD tries to override that by forcing boards to prioritize these broad environmental and human rights goals embedded in European law. It's a direct assault on U.S. sovereignty over its own corporate affairs.
And there's a real-world example of this legal conflict happening right now, in Alabama of all places.
Yes. This is where the abstract becomes very real. There's ongoing litigation against Mercedes-Benz in Alabama, where the United Auto Workers, the UAW, tried to do an end run around Alabama's right-to-work laws.
Wow.
They invoked the German Supply Chain Act, which is Germany's national version of the CSDDD's philosophy, to argue that the U.S. plant had obligations under German law that superseded Alabama's labor structure.
So they were using a German law to fight a case in an American state.
Essentially, yes. If the CSDD takes full effect, it supercharges the ability of NGOs and others to sue U.S. businesses in European courts. Brussels is trying to use the threat of lawsuits in Paris or Berlin to force a board in Alabama to ignore its own state's constitution. That's why Washington is taking this so seriously.
So what can the U.S. do? What are the pushback options?
Well, there are both legislative and executive options. On the legislative side, the main thing is the Protect USA Act of 2025, introduced by Senator Hagerty.
And what would that do?
It would straight up prohibit American companies from complying with the CSDDD unless the president grants a national interest waiver. And critically, it also creates a private right of action. So any affected U.S. business could sue a company for complying with the CSDDD. It raises the legal risk of compliance here at home.
That's a pretty strong defense. What can the executive branch do on its own?
The executive branch can use regulatory reciprocity. Basically, make life harder for European firms operating here. For instance, European firms are currently exempt from filing under U.S. GAAP accounting standards. That exemption could be revoked.
So raise their compliance costs.
Exactly. The SEC could revoke their exemption to the Human Capital Management Rule, requiring new disclosures. Or they could waive European exemptions to Sarbanes-Oxley. It's all about sending a clear message. If you impose unilateral burdens on our firms, we will impose reciprocal burdens on yours.
This whole crisis in Europe, both political and economic, brings us to the most unsettling comparison, the very structure of government itself. I was reading a piece by a former EU administrative aide, we'll call him Mark. After he left Brussels, he described this vast subterranean world of technical committees that no citizen had ever voted for, drafting directives that affected everything from farming to product safety.
An invisible government?
Exactly. He said he realized the European dream had become this administrative machine that was too entrenched to fail, leading to this institutional paralysis where the machine's only purpose was to perpetuate itself. His view of Brussels as an unaccountable deep state is a haunting blueprint.
It is, and we can actually analyze that feeling of entrenchment rigorously using Madisonian federal theory.
As in James Madison.
The very same. Madison was deeply concerned with the tension between a federal government and democracy. He identified 5 key variables that determine whether a union is built to last or whether it's doomed to collapse like the U.S. Articles of Confederation. And the EU's scores on these variables reveal its inherent instability.
Okay, so let's break them down. What's the first variable, the absolute foundation?
Variable I is juridic authority. Where does the government get its ultimate legal power? Madison's ideal was clear. The federal government has to get its authority from ratification by the people of the states. That makes the federal government paramount.
Which is what the U.S. Constitution did.
Exactly. The EU, by contrast, is built entirely on treaties ratified by member governments, not the people directly. This puts the EU on the same legal footing as the failed Articles of Confederation. It creates profound structural deficit. It's why the right to unilaterally leave is baked into the EU system.
It lacks that ultimate popular mandate.
It does. Its whole structure is conditional, which makes it inherently less stable.
Okay, so a weak foundation. What about how power is exercised? Variable 2. The source of ordinary powers. Who appoints the decision makers?
Right. Madison argued a union would fail if its key officials were appointed by and answered to state governments rather than the people of the union as a whole.
Because the states would always be undermining the center.
Precisely. The U.S. Constitution was designed to give the House and the President a national power base. The EU, however, scores very low here. Its most powerful bodies, like the European Council and the Council of Ministers, are made up of officials from the member state governments. They serve at the pleasure of their home capitals.
So their loyalty is divided?
It contributes heavily to the democratic deficit. Citizens feel their government is run by officials serving external interests. It's a key structural weakness.
Okay, on to variable 3, the operation of powers. How the central government actually enforces its will. You said this was Madison's biggest fear.
It was. He called legislating only for states, the federal mode, the great and radical vice of confederacies. Because if a state says no, your only recourse is coercion or force against the state itself. A successful federation has to legislate directly for individuals. It has to be able to reach past the state government to the citizen.
And the U.S. federal government does that, the EU.
The EU largely operates in that dangerous federal manner. EU law is generally executed and enforced by the member states. The EU's executive arm, the Commission, doesn't have a federal police force or a huge enforcement bureaucracy. Madison would have seen this as a fatal flaw.
But clearly the EU has found a way to compensate for this. It hasn't collapsed yet. What's the workaround?
The judicial branch steps in to fill that executive gap. The European Court of Justice, the ECJ, has been incredibly assertive. It functions as a judicial substitute for a powerful EU executive. It enforces the supremacy of EU law over national law.
And how does it do that in practice across 27 different countries?
Through a very clever mechanism called the preliminary ruling procedure. It allows national courts to refer questions about EU law to the ECJ for an authoritative ruling. It's like an appeal in advance. This ensures the law is applied uniformly everywhere, even without a central police force. It was a brilliant, if undemocratic, innovation.
Which brings us to a shared strategy that both the EU and the US use: regulation through rights litigation. Why is this so attractive to central governments?
Because it's politically and fiscally cheap. A central government can avoid the massive cost of building a huge bureaucracy by just establishing federal rights and then relying on private citizens, NGOs, and lawyers to enforce those rights in court.
So you pass the costs of enforcement onto the private sector or the states?
Exactly. It's decentralized enforcement. Both the U.S., especially after the 1960s rights revolution, and the EU have used this strategy very effectively to extend central power without expanding the central payroll.
And there's a fascinating historical parallel here in how the federal courts in both systems first acted as economic regulators.
Yes, it's true. Initially, federal courts in both polities were focused on protecting laissez-faire economic rights. The U.S. Supreme Court in the Gilded Age would strike down state labor laws. The ECJ did something similar called negative integration, striking down national regulations that it saw as barriers to the internal market.
So the courts were actually getting in the way of state-level democratic programs.
They were. And the key insight is that this judicial negative integration eventually created enormous political pressure for the creation of new, positive rights at the federal level. Once the center used its courts to take away state power, it was eventually forced to use its legislatures to replace that power with new, uniform federal standards.
This all raises huge questions about accountability. What's the impact on citizen participation?
It's a paradox. On one hand, moving authority to Brussels or Washington moves decision-making further from the citizen, and voter turnout in federal elections often reflects that distance. But paradoxically, the growth of federal power has also forced greater openness and transparency onto state and local administrations.
How so?
Well, the U.S. has the Administrative Procedure Act. The EU pushes for standardized administrative processes in its member states. Federal mandates often require state agencies to become more professional and transparent, so you might lose control over the policy itself, but the local administration of that policy can sometimes become fairer.
So we get better local bureaucracy, but worse political accountability overall. This brings us to the ultimate structural flaw, the credit assignment problem. Explain how this plays out for the American voter.
The credit assignment problem is the immutable flaw that comes from dividing authority. You have federal policymaking, but state and local implementation. Because of the split, state and federal governments can constantly shift the blame for failures and claim all the credit for successes.
And the voter is left completely confused about who is actually responsible.
Exactly. Think about infrastructure. A bridge collapses. The Federal Department of Transportation blames the state for poor execution. The state blames D.C. for insufficient funding or too much red tape. Who do you hold accountable at the ballot box?
The COVID-19 response was a perfect example of this.
A perfect example. Federal agencies blame states for slow vaccine rollouts. States blame federal agencies for supply chain bureaucracy. The EU suffers from this acutely. Brussels issues a directive, national capitals implement it poorly, and then everyone joins in to blame Brussels bureaucracy. This confusion undermines democracy because if voters can't clearly assign responsibility, they can't punish failure. That is the end-stage paralysis of the administrative state. #outro. So, to summarize Europe's terminal report card, the European Union suffers from these substantial and perhaps terminal federalism deficits. Its reliance on national governments for its legitimacy, that juridic authority problem, and its failure to operate directly on individuals make the union structurally unsound by Madison's criteria. And any plans for deeper integration are likely to just make things worse, because expansion only adds cultural and economic disparities that undercut the fragile consensus that's held it together so far.
So the return of sovereignty we're seeing in Europe isn't just a political fad.
No, it's a structural necessity. It's the inevitable result of institutional overreach.
And that structural necessity is the final, stark warning back to the United States. The bureaucratic structure in Brussels, with its unaccountable managers, its rule by regulation instead of law, its democratic deficits, that's not some isolated foreign curiosity. It is the fully realized end-stage version of the administrative deep state that Washington should be paying very close attention to. A polity that systematically strips its people of national identity and subordinates its economy to unaccountable regulators faces inevitable paralysis and ultimately dissolution. That quiet, paper-shuffling stagnation that has crippled the Franco-German engine is the inevitable destiny of any government that lets administrative power replace popular sovereignty. And America really has to choose whether to learn from Europe's painful reckoning before our own credit assignment problems and our own regulatory avalanche make our system just as structurally unsound.